everyone, and welcome to this episode of an IngeniousU, the podcast where we have conversations with higher ed's most creative thinkers and doers. And today's guest certainly meets that description and some. Sanjay Sarma is the Fred Fort Flowers and Daniel Fort Flowers Professor of Mechanical Engineering at MIT from 2012 until 2021. Sanjay led MIT Open Learning, first as director, then as dean, and finally as vice president. And I'm going to be asking him during the conversation to tell us a little bit more about MIT Open Learning. So in 2020, he published a wonderful book called Grasp, The Science Transforming How We Learn, which he co-authored with Luke Quinto. Previously, Sanjay co-founded the Auto ID Center at MIT, developed many of the key technologies behind the electronic product code suite of radio frequency identification standards now used worldwide. He has authored over 100 academic papers on wide-ranging topics and is the recipient of numerous awards for teaching and research, including the McVicker Fellowship, the Business Week eBiz Award, and Information Week's Innovators and Influencers Award. And most immediately and impressively, Sanjay has been at the center of most of MIT's innovations and teaching in the teaching and learning space during the past several years. So as always, we will post his full bio in the show notes. But Sanjay, I am so pleased to welcome you to the IngeniousU community.
Melissa, thank you. Thanks for a wonderful introduction and a real pleasure to be with you today.
Now, you were educated as a mechanical engineer and have developed an obvious passion for teaching and learning. And so I'd love to know something about the backstory for this. Specifically, can you tell us a little bit more about your personal, professional, educational journey, and how is it that you came to develop such a keen appreciation for teaching and learning?
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. I was educated in India. I went to a great school in India, met my wife there and so on. Very competitive, it was very hard to get in. And I was surrounded by really bright young people. And we went through the mill, we learned fluid mechanics and solid mechanics and things like that. But I always felt that I sort of got the math. I did not get the physicality of it. I didn't understand why we were studying this. I didn't understand the relevance. Now, as it turns out, I didn't do that well in school, by the way. I even flunked a course at one point, and I was determined not to be an academic. So I then went to work on an oil rig, in the North Sea of all places. And here I was suddenly, fixing problems with oil flow and with really advanced equipment where you see supersonic speeds and gas flares and so on. And suddenly, everything I learned began to become relevant. And it occurred to me that why wasn't that relevance made obvious at the beginning? I mean, if I had been given that, I would have absorbed material better. The cabinet, that is our brain, my brain, would have been better organized. I would have been able to retrieve things better because I knew what the application was. And so eventually I left the oil rig and returned to grad school, but I returned with a deep sense of urgency and appreciation for good learning, good teaching, and pedagogical approaches, but also the lost opportunities that I thought I'd have an opportunity to fix. I didn't actually think I'd become, work on learning per se. But I think that really shaped me.
Boy, what a transformational experience, but also speaks to your ability to make sense of it and to unpack and understand that it was important as you moved into graduate education. So that's also a great segue for my next question, because I know in your writing and in your speaking, you're outspoken, I think that's fair to say, in your belief about the traditional US educational system and the fact that it is flawed. So can you tell us what you think is the problem and how did we get here?
Yeah, so first of all, let me defend US education. It is flawed, but it's the best there is. It's better than anywhere else in the world, actually, which is a way to say the rest of the world is even more flawed. Doesn't mean that US education is the best it could be either. I think that we suffer from many issues. Our education system wasn't designed from scratch based on what we think are the principles of learning, etc. We inherited it. We inherited it from the French and German systems. And it suffers from many issues. One of them is that there is a fundamental assumption in our education system everywhere in the world, which is flawed, which is that the professor has a pen and the student's brain is a sheet of paper. And all the professor has to do is write on it and declare victory. That's really the essence of it. Actually, the student's brain should be seen sort of like a beautiful plant that's growing, and that's going to flower and bloom. And it needs water when it needs water. It needs nitrogen when it needs nitrogen, sunlight when it needs sunlight, not at your convenience as the teacher. You can't just give it a lifetime's worth of sunlight on day one or water on day one, declare victory. And that's the trap we fall into. If you put the student in the middle and the center, the student's formulating a model of the world. We know this even from early childhood. In fact, there's a beautiful book titled The Scientist in the Crib about how little kids are actually doing experiments to figure out the world. This is true even with young adults or with adults, which is they're trying to formulate a view of the world, and you have to inject information in the right way. You have to reinforce it in the right way. You got to back off when it's right. You got to make it practical when it's right. You got to make it relevant. And I'll leave you with this thought. Every parent knows this. And you might say, well, wait, parenting and childhood, what's it got to do with education? It's the same thing. Actually, human beings have this trade-off. A baby zebra can run within an hour of being born. Human children, the trade-off is we're going to take 15 years to learn, but we're very adaptable. That very same instinct, learning as a child and teaching as a parent, is the same instinct that we use in education, that should be used in education, because that's where it comes from, and we don't.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I'm going to come back to that in a couple of minutes, because I want to get your insights on what gets in the way in terms of how we actually structure learning in the educational system. But I'm going to hold that thought for a moment, because I want to ask you about your book. As I said, published in 2020, before the pandemic. You wrote it before the pandemic, right?
Yeah.
Most of it, yeah. And the book provides a wonderful walk through the concepts that we've come to associate with the science of learning in a really accessible way. I think it's one of the best books I've ever read, actually, in terms of helping to understand and unpack the conditions for learning, what really contributes to learning. So I highly recommend the book to any of our listeners, particularly as a starting point. I'm curious why you felt the need to write the book, and who did you have in mind as the audience for the book?
No, thank you. First of all, thank you for the kind words. And I have to say, Luke Quinto, who's a dear friend, but also an extraordinary friend, partner, writer, bouncer of ideas. We really had a lot of fun doing this. And we also try to keep it sort of easy. We both have a little irreverence and so on. The book is actually written for 3 audiences, believe it or not. It is not written for teachers only. It's actually written primarily for learners and for parents. Now, because the center of learning is the learner, and it's really written for the learner. So the reason I initiated the book was when I started researching the science of learning, there was a lot of dogma out there, which I had to peel off and really begin to understand the cognitive science, the cognitive psychology of learning. And there's some amazing research there. And the book is arranged, all the way from neurons all the way to, metacognition. And I started giving talks about it in the 2013, 14, 15 timeframe. And many people came and said, you should write a book about it. Mm-hmm. Well, I was busy writing another book on the Internet of Things, which is my field. But I began to realize as I gave the lectures that when you talk about science, medical stuff, you think, unfortunately, you have this impression that it's going to be very sort of antiseptic and clinical, oh, you should eat proteins in the morning and exercise for 18 minutes and then study for 11 minutes. And then, but actually what I realized is very human, and there's a historical journey through it, right? Which is Thorndike and Dewey and how it evolved. And it sort of maps into some of the traps we fell into. And so with Luke, we started sort of evolving it, and the story sort of wrote itself. And we tried to make it accessible by being, as I said, irreverent, but also making it more human. So the book sort of wrote itself, but really, in the end, it's for learners. And I think parents and teachers next.
Yeah, and that comes across clearly. And I think it's maybe one of the reasons why I really appreciate the book, one of many, because that makes it unique. A lot of the books that are out there on learning science don't have the learner as a primary focus. And I know as I was reading through, and I reread it previously, but I reread it again over the holidays in anticipation for our conversation. And because I'm now teaching doctoral students and working with students who are really, really bright, but who've not learned how to learn, there were several points in the book where I thought, oh, I need to share this with my students, because I do think it will be very helpful. And the stories that you tell, irreverent or not, are really helpful for making what you write and the concepts so much easier to understand.
No, yeah, thank you. I think that one of the challenges in our education system is actually unsympathetic to the very human needs and foibles of people. The fact that the lecture plows on regardless of a student's attention wandering, and that's nature after about 10 minutes, is in fact deeply insensitive to our clients, who are, I think, mostly human beings. And I think that we lose people, and then we wonder why we lost them.
Yeah.
And it actually diminishes the self-esteem of the student themselves. They feel like, oh, I screwed up. No, you're human. The system does not work for you. And so I think if we can sort of square that circle, we will make a lot of progress in fixing education. So thinking in layers is a very engineering thing. And so that was an analogy that Luke and I sort of landed on. I used to call it the cognitive stack. In engineering, in the internet, it's called the IP stack, Internet Protocol stack. So that's a little sort of a nerdy thing, but it turns out to be a good abstraction, because you need to understand how things work at the neuron level. And neurons are, all animals pretty much have neurons, right? I mean, any animal, any multicelled animal has some sensing. And eventually you get to the level where they have neurons, whether it's an octopus or a C. elegans worm or a fruit fly, they all have neurons, or a California snail, right? Which we talked about, the Ecclesia. So it turns out that, and then, so that's at the low level. Then level 2 is one level higher, which is, the neurotransmitters and how curiosity impacts, learning. It turns out curiosity is the most important thing, which we've somehow sort of weeded out of education. Then there's a third level, which is, looking at things, sort of trying to explain things from the perspective of, are you thinking inside out or outside in? Are you trying to explain things from neurons outside? Or are you looking at the whole brain, right? Which is where Thorndike and Dewey got into a battle. So that's a third level. And then there's a fourth level, which is thinking about thinking, which is how do you do metacognition, which is how do you think about the education as a whole. So that's why we organized it that way. Now, the ultimate goal in science is to connect across the stack. Can you explain all the way from the neuron level, all the way to how this amazing, beautiful thing called the brain, with all its emerging properties, its quirks, its idiosyncrasies, the things that make someone lovable or interesting or infuriating. Can you explain all the way? And it turns out no, because there are 86 billion neurons. Just because you can explain how 2 neurons interact or 10 doesn't mean you can explain that emergent property of 86 billion neurons. So you have to look at it in layers. There are a couple of things, by the way, that you can actually explain across. And then one of them is spaced retrieval, space learning, because it turns out you can sort of explain it at the neuron level. You can explain it at the second level, which is you can explain how curiosity and all these things help, and you can explain it all the way at the you can see that property at the learning level of a classroom of beautiful brains, right? But not a lot of things can be explained up and down the stack. And in some ways, the battle in education over the last 100 years has been people trying to explain it inside out, which is starting at the neuron and trying to generalize to the whole brain. And people starting by being humble and saying, we don't understand it all the way down. Let's start with the whole brain and be human about it and explain it. And that latter, in my view, is the right approach because it was more humble. There was more humility. And that's where Dewey comes in. And that's the Dewey approach. And a lot of good learning practice sort of reflects what Dewey thought about and something I talk about. Thorndike started by, he didn't even understand it all the way, but he started studying cats and pigeons and came up with this behaviorist analogy, which is very impoverished in terms of understanding the beauty of the brain. And unfortunately, that's the battle. That approach won the battle. It's sort of a pseudoscience to some extent, or a limited science, a reductionist science. And a lot of our educational systems are based on that. In fact, Ellen Langeman, who's the dean at Harvard, the Graduate School of Education, said we need to understand that Thorndike won and Dewey lost. And the holistic view of the brain has taken a back seat to the sort of more data-driven scientists. I call it, people call it scientism approach to the brain. So it's a mouthful of an answer, but that sort of addresses, I think, the questions you asked.
Yeah, no, that's very, very helpful. Let me, if you don't mind, I'd like to dig a little deeper. From the learner's perspective then, how might I become a better learner? Let's say the spacing and recall concept. So what would that mean in terms of what I might do to improve my learning?
So it turns out that the best way to learn, I'll give you a formula. If you can't really reduce it to a formula, but I'll try. And I'll give you a high-level view of it. The best way to learn is to learn in short sprints. At the end of a 5-10 minute sprint, ask yourself questions about the stuff you just learned. And then go do something else. Interleave, right? So if you're doing math, if you're doing areas and volumes, do areas, but then do areas for spheres, then go do areas for cones, surface areas for cones, then do volumes, then come back, switch. And then come back tomorrow and try and solve some problems. And then come back a week later and try and solve some problems. And it seems a little bit chaotic, but that's how we learn. The reason is we like differences. And forgetting, it turns out, is a very essential part of learning, because when you start forgetting something, the brain, by the way, is incented to forget stuff, because you hear so much junk you don't need to remember, right? It's trying to forget. It just doesn't know what is important and what it should forget. So if you remind the brain, just as you're about to forget, it says, oh, this is important, I need to remember this. So mix things up, short sprints. Immediately after learn something, ask yourself questions about it, then do something completely different. Revisit it a day later, revisit it a week later, revisit it a month later. And if you're forgetting, don't feel bad. That's actually an opportunity. Remind yourself, and that's how learning occurs. So that's one very simple thing. And by the way, if you use Duolingo or learn these language programs, they do some of this stuff.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now,
let me give you a high-level thing. It turns out that a lot of practices where we think we're learning and we're doing a good job of learning, you reread things and highlight them and all that, don't work very well. And a lot of these practices that I described to you, they have the unfortunate they have this unfortunate thing in that they seem more difficult to do and you feel like you learned less. Actually, what you're doing when you do all this, what I described to you, is effortful learning. And it turns out it's effortful learning, where you expose the fact that you've forgotten it and you're recalling it. It's there that the learning occurs. And actually, it results in long-term learning. If you're just trying to pass an exam, then actually cramming works pretty well, but you won't remember for life.
Right. Yeah, it doesn't stick, does it? So thank you. That was a very, very helpful. What about, you referenced curiosity. So as a learner, how can you make curiosity work for you?
Look, this is such a beautiful, I'm so happy that I discovered this. It sort of filled me with the warm glow, because remember I said I expected something antiseptic and clinical.
Yeah.
And then we discovered the importance of curiosity. It is fascinating. When you're hungry, saliva flows, and you go look for food. If you're an animal, you forage, you become, right? I see curiosity as something similar. And the equivalent to saliva is dopamine. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter. There's a lot of research now. I'm learning more and more after we wrote the book about how novelty and curiosity generate dopamine. And once you generate dopamine, a certain circuit is awakened. It's called the dopaminergic circuit. Then once you activate the dopaminergic circuit, learning comes easy, because it's like you're hungry. The saliva's out, you're eating. And if we could sort of flip everything and focus on curiosity and relevance and why this is important, the rest follows. But actually, what we've done is the opposite. What we're saying is, don't be curious. Take my word for it. Open your brain and I'll write on it. And that's our problem. So this whole dopaminergic circuit, novelty, curiosity is central, and we've lost the plot.
What about overlearning?
There are some things that you do want to overlearn, right? I mean, for example, we like to think, Luke and I, that we're very progressive in teaching and learning, but there are some who say, well, you don't have to learn the multiplication table because, you have it on your iPhone. Why do you need it? No, you need it. I'm sorry. You do, actually, right? Because you need a certain facility, right? You're driving your car, you're running out of gas, you got to figure out how many miles are left, and whether you'll get there, how many miles you get per gallon. You're not gonna pull out your iPhone. In common activity, there are certain things that have become instinctive. Language is another one, right? So overlearning, in some respects, you do need it. I don't think you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think you got to get your multiplication tables. I'm sorry, right? But in certain other places, it can be an impediment, right? So there's a trade-off. There's a gray area.
Yeah, it raises for me the question about the chatbot. There's been so much discussions, right, lately about the fact that we're not going to have to teach writing anymore at some point because we can rely on. So I would imagine you have an opinion about that, given what I'm hearing you say.
I believe deeply that writing is the highest form of thinking. And if we concede everything that is human to a robot, we cannot complain when the robot takes our job, when the robot takes our pleasure. The chatbot is amazing. We should see it as a friend, as a coach, but it is not the real thing. Having used ChatGPT now, as I said, obsessively, what I find now is it's quite exceptional, quite interesting. I made it write a poem the other day, and then I made it to reframe it as a rap, and it did all that. But if you look deeply, it's actually very banal. And what makes humans different and, as I said earlier, surprising and lovable and infuriating all at the same time is we're not banal. And I, as I said, I've already complained about multiplication tables. If we ever say don't teach writing because ChatGPT will do it for us, I'll be the first to go with and protest on the streets.
Well, and I know in your book you write that you believe that the best education is still a human to human education. And so I think that's what you're talking about there in terms of the role that technology might play, should play. Is there anything, do you want to say some more about that, or?
Yeah. So first of all, I think we have a misunderstanding about learning. If you watch a kitten learn from its mom how to hunt, there is no lecture, right? It is entirely what is called implicit learning. You know, the cat has a curriculum. She brings home a dead mouse, and then a somewhat dead mouse, and then a live mouse, and she's creating a scaffold for the kitten to learn. But it's by mimicking, it's scaffolding, and it's all implicit. There is no lecture. I've never seen a cat give a lecture, although I've seen a lot of cat videos recently. We, human beings, have the advantage of language, and we can create an explicit curriculum, which is important. But there's an implicit curriculum, which is irreplaceable. Ask this of any soccer player or football player or baseball player. Ask it of a pilot. Sully, probably learned something implicitly which he applied when he landed that plane on the Hudson. Ask it of a thinker, of a researcher, of a painter, of a writer. There's something deeply implicit. And it's a false dichotomy somehow, and a false assumption that somehow we can make things explicit and we can make everything explicit. That implicit channel will never go away, and it's essential. So humans as teachers should never be removed.
That's a wonderfully important message that educators need to be reminded about, among others, because I think I see this in so many people that I know who are teaching, particularly in the K-12 arena these days, and they feel discouraged about their impact or lack thereof, as they describe it. And it leads me to my question about what gets in the way. You read your book, and as an educator, I read your book. It all makes intuitive sense to me. There's a lot of it seems commonsensical in some ways, and yet, we're a long ways away from having the typical learning experience designed with these concepts in mind. And so, how do you make sense? How do you make sense of that? What gets in the way? Is it organizational culture? Is it false beliefs?
Yeah, it's a very important question. I think I've been thinking about this a lot, and I think that, or I should say, I know I'm thinking about it a lot. But what I think is that if you look at humanity before we were organized, right? There's no structure, so everything was difficult. So we introduced organization and structure and systems. And often the system is the problem. Education is no different. Our systems are designed in a certain way. Thorndike 1. In fact, there is, I think, a bit of a divorce, just to use high school and, in general, right, between the way things are organized and the way where teachers and parents and children know they need to go. They're sort of divorced. And the reason is, it comes back to the term scientism, which is the sense that we want to measure everything. But some things can't be measured today. They can only be measured 10 years from now. So we only do the things we can measure now, as opposed to being really thoughtful about doing the things and recognizing that things can only be measured 10 years from now. So we go to short-term goals. So I think the structure is deeply immobilizing in many respects. And that's a very high-level answer. But the low-level answer is, if I wanted to say, I wanted to do space retrieval, right? How do I do it? It's really impossible. If I wanted to say, I want to flip the classroom, do I have the facilities? Will the school support me? Will the college support me? Right? When do I invest the time? And then if I want to go on a field trip, do I have the resources? How do I get, it's every little thing becomes difficult. Look, my mother was a teacher. I think that the most impactful people in my life have been teachers. And almost every one of my teachers was a human being.
Yeah.
I'm being sarcastic. Every one of them was, in fact, a human being. But my point is that they did it despite, not because.
Let me switch gears. I want to ask you about MIT, because MIT, you've been, the school's been at the forefront of just about every institution level innovation in recent times. And in your various roles, including serving as MIT's first ever, I think, Director of Digital Learning, beginning in 2012, you've been in the middle of just about every one of those experiments, which must have been great fun for you, I would think. So you now have the advantage of hindsight. So I would love to have you unpack some of these learning experiments and what you've learned about educational innovation, what you've learned about transformational learning, I guess, as a result of these experiments. And there's a lot of them. So I don't know where you want to start, from course 2.007 to Teal, to the MOOCs, to MITx, Open Learning Today, credentialing. I know you're really excited, I think, about the MicroMasters from what I've read. So where would you start, and how can you help us unpack some of these?
So maybe a little bit of history might help. MIT was
Sure.
established in 1861, before the Civil War, and then the Civil War broke out in first classes in 1865. The word technology was new. Literally, the word technology was new when MIT was established. It's the first high-tech school. And technology was this vocational thing. It was only during wars and construction. That's when in the concept of technology slowly started getting elevated from vocation to something. Vocation is a good thing. MIT, we don't reject vocation, right? But something more and more sort of scientific and more profound. I mean, the recognition started occurring. And MIT has always had a very earnest approach of learning by doing. In fact, our Great Seal has a person reading a book and a person holding a sledgehammer. And the campus, if you visit the campus, the first floor, all the ceilings are very high because the workshops are supposed to be in there. And so this is something that runs deep in the soul of MIT, which is just do it, try it, build it, break it, weld it, bend it, take it into the field. And during World War I and then during World War II, this became, sort of a central thing of our society because technology became very fundamental. But that earnestness never went away. And so this business of getting your hands dirty is very central to MIT, right? And that earnestness also gives my colleagues a wonderful, innocent sense of experimentation and a lack of rules, right? And this is, and also a strange desire to just give things away. So over the course of 150 years, I mean, MIT by definition is an experimental innovation, actually. I mean, an educational innovation. But over the course of 150 years, there have been waves and waves of innovation, for example, putting the basis of science behind engineering, making it much more sort of model-based, and then computers and artificial intelligence. Another one was our engineering education requires a lot of humanities course. It's actually a liberal arts engineering education. But more recently, there was in the 2000 timeframe, a few of my amazing colleagues, Hal Abelson being the lead, decided to give our entire curriculum away for free to the world, and that's open-courseware. And people thought, why are you doing that?
Right, that's pretty counterintuitive. That's pretty counterintuitive.
Yeah, and I don't think we could. I mean, I can articulate it now. I was actually involved. Actually, my wife was a consultant by coincidence in that effort, so I was deeply involved in that. It's because we realized it is not the explicit that counts. The magic is here on the campus, and it's implicit. We'll give the explicit away to the world for free by the curriculum. If you read, take it. And by the way, please use it, benefit from it. But that's only one piece of it. It's the implicit, right? Be on campus, be with your colleagues, with your friends, your professors, your machinists, make something, break something, have a discussion, have an argument. So that was open-courseware. And then around the same time, the Teal was launched. This is John Belcher and Laurie Breslow, amazing colleagues, and they launched something called the Technology Enhanced Active Learning Classroom. And the idea was, actually, they will tell you they were inspired by something at RPI and then something at another school, which is called Studio Physics. And the idea was, why are students sitting there sort of fading out in lectures on physics when they could actually be doing it So rethinking the classroom around circular tables where they did experiments to learn magnetism or electric chargers and so on. That was another transformation. Then we launched edX and MITx. And then another issue that we took on, which is, why does admissions work the way it does? This is a more and more interesting and I think troublesome question for us. So we introduced the MicroMasters. And in the MicroMasters, we said, we'll take a master's program. I did this with my dear friend Yossi Sheffi and Chris Kaplis. We started with the supply chain MicroMasters. We'll take the master's program. We'll split it into two halves. It's a one-year master's. We'll take the first half, which is a semester, take all the courses, put them online. Students can take them for free if they want. That's how MOOCs work, right? They can pay a little bit, get a certificate. There's a final exam. If they finish, we'll give them a certificate called the MicroMasters. No admissions. And if they have the MicroMasters, they can apply to MIT. And if they get in, they finish in half the time at half the cost. That was the MicroMasters. So that was an attempt to reinvent admissions by eliminating it. We call it inverted admissions, right?
And what was the motivation for, you wanted to make the education more accessible? Did you want to reach more people? Was that the...
Yeah, it was actually two or three things. One is we want to make it more accessible, for sure. And you can see that was also before COVID, by the way. And during COVID, supply chain became a fundamental issue, right?
Right.
So that's one. The second is we really seek talent. And this was a dragnet to find those gems at the bottom of the sea and pull them out. And that was actually essential. That was the second thing. And the third thing was to help the economy, because it turns out a lot of companies wanted people to get upskilled in this space. And they didn't have to leave their jobs. They could do it part-time and just get the MicroMasters. And so it was a win-win-win. It actually worked. And the cost of education, we halved the cost of education of a master's.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So there's many things, but I think that if you can frame problems, you can find solutions. I think the courage is in framing and stating the problem sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah, and a willingness, right, to see it clearly, which is really tough sometimes in an institutional setting. So how's the MicroMasters doing? Do you know enrollment wise?
Oh yeah, it's doing spectacularly well. We started with this one MicroMasters. MIT has now 5 going on 6. We have 1.25, actually it's more than that, million people enrolled in just MIT's MicroMasters. Get that, 1.25 million.
1.25 from around the world.
From around the world, just MIT.
Yeah.
And there are now more than 50 MicroMasters from 25 universities on 4 continents.
Yeah, and at MIT, do you know how many then go on and get a master's degree?
So we, at a small campus, we can only admit 50. So our distillation column is extremely, we distill a lot. So we get really great talent, but actually a lot of the people who finish are very good. So a bunch of universities around the world have said, hey, can you send people our way? Of course, we can't send them. It's up to the students to apply.
Right.
We have dozens and dozens of partner universities, ASU, Purdue, even Harvard, all over the world, that will take folks who come through the MicroMasters and give them the second half, the regular masters at their school. But we're limited to a small campus.
That's what I was wondering. I would think a network would be very, very attractive and, quite significant. So, can you talk about the open learning today? What is open learning today? What's part of it? So
open learning is, I stepped down as VP after doing it for almost 10 years. In June this year, I'm a regular professor now, and I was on sabbatical actually. It is a wonderful team of more than 150 people. It has 2 sides to it, 2 sides, and then there's research. There's a third piece to it. So the 2 sides are all the stuff that is free or freemium, like OpenCourseWare, MITx. You can take the content for free, but you pay for a certificate. MicroMasters, so that's one side of it. We have a group of people who work with faculty to produce it. Then we got to pay the bills. So we have a professional side, which is meant for working folks at companies who are willing to pay money to learn executive knowledge. So we have something called XPro, We have something called boot camps where people come in and do hands-on activities. We have something called Horizon, which is where they can read about cutting edge stuff. So that's paid only, and that sort of pays for the first piece. And then we have a bunch of research. So we have the Jameel World Education Lab, which is a consortium of universities and entities around the world that come together to talk about the latest in education. We have the MIT Integrated Learning Initiative, which looks at the science of learning. We have the Center for Advanced Virtuality, which looks at augmented reality and virtual reality. We have a Center for AI, RAISE, RAISE. So there's a research piece, there's a freemium piece, and there's the corporate piece. And together, they're the engine that drive open learning.
Yeah, yeah. And this was your baby, yes?
Yes.
During your,
yeah. It had many parents, but I was the head. We built this entity, and it is an amazing group of people. It's a buzzword activity, and friends.
Yeah, no, it's kind of mind-boggling actually to look at all the innovation that's happening there on different levels. And I'm going to come back as a final question and ask you about that, because I do want to get your crystal ball thinking about the future. But before I do that, I want to ask you again about your book. As you said, you wrote it before COVID, and yet the ideas seem more relevant now, coming out of the pandemic, if in fact we're coming out of the pandemic, who knows, really. But the ideas seem even more relevant now, given the transition that so many schools have been going through in terms of how they deliver learning. So I'm curious what your thinking is about what we've learned from the pandemic, what we need to pull forward in terms of learning, what we need to leave behind.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I mean, the pandemic is an endemic, I guess, now. And but I think that looking back over the last 2 or 3 years, what did nature do? Nature confiscated our right to be together. And we pulled it back. We fought as humanity fought back, and we sort of re-extracted that right to be together. And I wrote an article right at the beginning of the pandemic for the World Economic Forum, and I said, I hope we don't go back to the same old world where this hard-fought right of co-presence is squandered with boredom and one-way conversations. What we need to do is completely rethink education. We shouldn't recreate Zoom classrooms except we're sitting together, which is basically, the Zoom had neither the charm of proper online, nor the neither the effectiveness of proper online, which is asynchronous videos, think Khan Academy, edX, etc., nor the charm of at least being together, right? And my worry was we'd go back, and I have a sinking feeling we're going back to the old ways. The problem is the students have changed completely during COVID, right? And they are thirsting for engagement, and we're not giving them that. And engagement has to be the watchword. And to do engagement, I'm not trying to promote Luke in my book, but to do engagement, you got to rethink the classroom and pedagogies. And in fact, we're seeing this in student motivation. We're seeing it in student stick-with-itness. We have to rethink it. And I have a sinking feeling we're returning to an old normal when the students are in a new abnormal. And that is, I hope we fight it, but comfort zones are hard to get out of.
So I just have 2 more questions. I want to talk a little bit about innovation, because your book, your professional journey, tells such a compelling story about innovation and what it takes for both an individual and for an organization, a university, to try new things. And as you know, universities are not always known for being places where innovative thinking is easy to do, and yet the capacity for innovation is more important for many colleges and universities, their survival than ever before. And so you've given me a wonderful explanation already about the culture at MIT, the fact that innovation is in the DNA, it's in the water of the place, it sounds like. So if you think about institutions that are not like MIT, they may not have that heritage. They may not be as well resourced. Are there any lessons that still can be applied in terms of how do you create an innovative culture and get newer thinking going?
So I have a slightly dire sort of view of it, which is this. What makes MIT innovative is a certain sense of innate urgency. I want to do it tomorrow. That's, 3D printing was invented by one of my colleagues at MIT. 3D printing is, I want a part, I want to do it now, right? I mean, that's captures it, right? There's an innate urgency, intrinsic. Unfortunately, there's extrinsic urgency creeping up on higher ed. And higher ed may not know it yet. There are tremendous pressures going to land on them. First of all, some of them are clear, $1.75 trillion of student debt. Employers, how can these three things be true? Students are under debt pressure and are unhappy, their families are unhappy, right? Employers are saying, you're not producing what we need, there's a skills gap. How couldn't those two things be true? And college business models are breaking. How can these three things simultaneously be true? And then leaving that aside, there's a demographic bubble coming, which is after the 2008 crash, there was a baby bust actually. So student numbers are going to go down. Affirmative action is going to be ruled on by the Supreme Court. I fear that innovation is forced by urgency. As I said, MIT has it intrinsically, but I think that higher ed will end up in, unfortunately, reactive as opposed to proactive mode when this comes crashing down. So that's my dire feeling about it.
What about your own personal journey as an innovator? Are there some particular skills were you born as a highly creative, innovative thinker, or are there some particular skills or qualities that contribute to your success that you've honed along the way?
Thank you. Look, I truly, deeply believe that every baby is the ultimate innovator, because when a baby is born, she has to learn language, she has to learn to walk, she has to learn society, maybe learn multiple languages, learn math. I was very blessed and I was lucky in that my parents gave me a lot of freedom to go break things and, and also my personal journey, coincidences, etc. I had to sort of innovate. Actually, I'm somewhat lazy. I'm just telling you, right? So I'm quick on my feet, so that helped out. I'm restless. That's another thing. I probably have a smidgen of ADHD, but I think, honestly, innovation is a human thing. If you were in the Serengeti 80,000 years ago, you were innovative, trust me. You had to, find the fruit, make sure the monkey didn't eat it, make sure the lion didn't kill you, make sure you didn't step on a snake. You were innovating. You were finding new food sources. You were finding, new ways to survive. It is intrinsic. I think we just need to unleash it and give people the license. And one of the things we do in our education system is take away the license. We have all these expressions. Curiosity killed the cat. Why do we say that to people? All good things come to those who wait. It's all about controlling and repressing. And I think that's one thing that I somehow sort of found a way out of, but I think it's a very human thing. I truly, deeply believe this.
So my final question, in your book's epilogue, you talk about having the advantage today of hindsight. And you also write that there is no better day than today. Now, this was 3 years ago you wrote this, but no better day today than to announce a new age of learning. So what does that new age look like? What is your vision for the future of learning? What are you personally most excited about? Are there some innovations or some new things you've seen that you think, wow, that's really going to be game changing? And then what's the most important work that needs to be on our radar, that needs our attention right now?
I think that it's hard to do some of this within structures. It is outside the structures. I am a deep believer in micro-credentialing. sprints where you learn something new. And actually, with the gig economy, where people are working short-term gigs in various companies, we'll be on a new permanent treadmill of learning. So I'm actually very excited about learning something online, doing an internship, getting some expertise, getting a job, getting a gig, right? Applying it. Then meanwhile, as you're doing it, you realize that some other new skill is becoming important. You thought you were doing stuff on Twitter ads going down. I want to learn on TikTok. How do I, I'm a digital marketing person. I think we are entering a world when we are on a treadmill. If you are standstill, you fall off the back end. You got to keep running. And that, the oxygen of the economy is going to be learning. And there'll be a variety of ways to do it. And this is a new world. And where degrees fit into that is going to have to be figured out.
Indeed, that's going to be a big question for a lot of learners and also colleges and universities that make livelihood off of the offering of degrees. So Sanjay, thank you so much. I am so inspired, and I want to do whatever we can to get your thinking out to the educational world, because this is exactly what we need to be talking about and working on, I think, as we go forward. So thank you. Thank you so very much.
Thanks very much, Melissa. Such a pleasure. Happy New Year, and look forward to maybe meeting soon.
Yes, and likewise.